What happens when the world is seemingly devoid of color? Does that make it boring? Definitely not. Hello, my friend. It's day 2 of Painting the Wilderness World of Color, and today we're going kind of the opposite direction and we're exploring just how beautiful you can make a scene even if you only have a few neutral colors to work with. So today's scene is called Gray Lake, where we are painting some mountains in the background, some clouds, and a lake and a tree silhouette kind of jutting into the scene. I think it's going to be a really fun one, and I can't wait to show it to you. So let's get going. I'm very excited for this tutorial because I love color, but I also love neutrals. And I'm using some of my favorite kinds of neutrals, which are granulating pigments. We're going to talk more about that. First, I'm prepping my sketchbook by taping on all 4 sides, and I'm putting binder clips to just make it even more taut. And then I'm putting a piece of tape about a third of the way up horizontally. This is to separate the background from the midground and the foreground. So the lake is going to be below the tape, and then above the tape is where we're going to paint first. I'm grabbing my round number 10 brush with clean water, just prepping the area with clean water because we're going to do a wash of really light gray. And to make the light gray, I'm using Schminky Super Granulating Galaxy Black. You could also use Mars Black, though Mars Black is a little bit warmer. I added a bit of cerulean and lots of water. I cannot stress that I'm using so much water. To make this really, really light value gray. I don't want the sky actually to look super gray. I want it to look like pale, but I do want enough pigment so that while it's still wet, we can do this, which is I'm using a towel, just the corner of a towel to press down firmly and create just like a strip of cloud. And while it's still wet, while the wash is still wet. And then I'm going back into that cloud, that white space, with a round number 2 brush, and I'm just dabbing color in the middle of the cloud. So this is most important when painting clouds. And by the way, if this is too scary, you do not have to do this. You don't have to make the cloud. But we want to have that silver lining, right? We want to have the silver lining. And so which is the edge, the white edge. And so I'm painting the paint just in the center and kind of pushing it toward the edges, but I'm leaving the edges white. Then I'm going back into the cloud and I'm darkening up just the bottom of that shadowy space in the cloud. So I'm adding a little bit more pigment just along the bottom. Now I'm using Galaxy Black and Cerulean here, like different mixes. Both are granulating colors, and so I'm getting lots of texture. But again, and I also made a little tiny cloud over there too. But again, you don't have to do the clouds. It's totally optional. It's a little bit more advanced, but it is a fun way to kind of lift those clouds and then put shadows in the white space, leaving behind that silver lining to create clouds. So now we're starting on the mountain range. Again, just using Galaxy Black with a little cerulean and tons of water to create this first background mountain just a little bit below the clouds. So super light, very light value. Light value means more water, and light value also means farther away, right? And so we're creating these layers of mountain, and in order to give them depth, we're making them lighter in the back and then darker as we continue moving forward. So, and since this is a neutral color, we're using basically the same pigments, right? I'm not even really changing colors. It's also important to dry each mountain before you start painting the next one so that we can get those nice crisp edges. So I did that background mountain and then I let it dry, and then I did another layer of mountain just slightly darker, just a little bit more pigment, and then I let that dry. And then for this third mountain layer, a little bit more pigment right on top of the first 2, but then I'm adding a little bit of a tree texture. Notice that I'm not actually painting trees, I'm not painting individual trees. I'm just using the tip of my brush of my number 10 to kind of add little pointies to the mountain edge while that mountain layer is still wet. I can do this. This mountain layer is still wet because I used lots of water to paint that mountain layer originally, right? This is my third mountain layer, still using super granulating colors, and you can see the texture, right? You can see how the pigment is just kind of separating into different textures. So I let that third mountain layer dry. Here's number 4. I'm doing the exact same thing, just a slightly darker pigment, just very slightly darker. And then going back in and adding more pigment if I want it to be a little bit darker. But I painted those trees just like I did in the previous layer. And we're gonna do a few of these tree mountain layers. So the thing about mountain layers, and they're gonna be basically the same as we've done before, just gradually growing a little bit darker by adding more pigment to the mix. The thing about mountain layers is the more patience you have, the more layers you're willing to add, like the slower you're willing to go, the cooler it can look because it just looks like there's these endless amount of mountain layers here. And so, if you don't want to do this many, you can do just 3. 3 would be great. But I'm doing, let's see how many is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think maybe 6 by the end. And then gradually getting darker every time. This is the final mountain layer. And I also want to note that I'm mixing up where they're coming from, right? They're not all exactly the same. Some are coming from one side, some are coming from the other, some span the whole length. Uh, the most important thing is, especially if you're wanting to make it look like there's that tree texture, is to add those little bumps just along the edge so it looks like there's foliage peeking out behind from that silhouette, right? So we let all those mountain layers dry. I lifted up the tape, and now it's time to paint the lake. So I added just a little bit of tallow turquoise to my galaxy black cerulean mix on my palette so that I'm painting a slightly greenish hue. But notice it's still very light. I'm using really, really watery paint here to just like prime my surface basically for adding some textures. So my lake is wet with that really, really, really watery grayish green, grayish turquoise color. And now with my smaller size 6 brush, I picked up a little bit more pigment of Galaxy Black, and I'm just, while using the wet on wet technique, I'm just doing zigzags, right? Sometimes my paper has dried, like toward the bottom, you can see my paper has dried a little bit more, so you can see the zigzags a little bit better. That wasn't really intentional, but that's okay. Because what I want is a mix. When you're painting water, what you want is a mix of like visible lines, wave lines that you can see, and then blurry mixes, more blurry textures. So I'm just adding a little bit more cerulean to my palette here. And to make it a little bit more blue, I added, I think, a little bit more tallow turquoise also with the Galaxy Black. These are the 3 main colors that I'm using. And then I added a little bit of jadeite as well. No, that's a lie. Cascade green. Jadeite and Cascade green are both granulating colors from Daniel Smith. So I added a bit of Cascade green to that mix. So it's just like this fun kind of granulating turquoise, very, very light mix though. So we're not gonna see it very well yet, but we're gonna gradually make it darker. So back to what I was saying, you do zigzags all the way across when you're trying to create a waveform. And it's okay if some of the zigzags kind of blend into each other and some of them don't. Like there's some dried paint lines, and then there's lots of blurries. And that's what I want. I want that mix. And so this is messy. Doing techniques like this where you're just kind of focusing on the zigzags, going back and forth, leaving behind some white space, it's really uncomfortable because the watercolor is doing what it wants sometimes, and you might get some textures that you weren't expecting or you weren't intending to create, and that's okay. One kind of general guideline I would say is the closer to the foreground you are, the more white space, the more hard edges you might want to have, and the bigger the waves are. So the bigger the waves are, the bigger the ripples that you can see, and the darker the waves are. We're not going to create very, very dark waves, but we're going to add a little bit of kind of like mid-value pigment just while some of the waves are a little bit wet. And then as it gets toward the back, we're going to leave that lighter. We're going to leave it more blurry. We're going to leave it so like there's not very much definition in the lake toward the back, and that's going to help us with the depth effect. So I did grab a flat brush, and I'm trying to do kind of like a dry brush technique to create very, very tiny ripples in the back. It didn't really work this time, but that's okay. It added a little bit of texture, and I decided to just kind of leave it be where it was. Because when I'm painting these, I'm experimenting too. So I'm gradually adding a tiny bit darker low lights to those foreground waves. And at some point, I thought, that looks pretty good. So again, I can't stress enough that I experimented. I was experimenting. I was playing. I was messing around. And I just kind of let the watercolor do what it was going to do. This was going to be the end. This was going to be the finished product. But then I thought, I don't know, it just kind of looks like, the water is one scene and the mountains are another scene. And so I wanted something to kind of bring the two halves of the scene together. And so I decided to paint a tree kind of jutting into the scene from the foreground and some grass coming up from the bottom. And so in order to paint this tree, I'm using galaxy black, like the darkest galaxy black, because this is a silhouette in the foreground, right? It's the darkest thing in the scene. And so I'm painting branches first. And the trunk. We have just like a sliver of the trunk coming up, and then we're painting branches that are starting from the trunk and dragging outward, and then just kind of tapering off. Lots of tiny little branches crisscrossing each other. And then I grabbed my size 6 brush, and I'm just putting blobs, basically, just like blobs for leaves, leaving behind white space, adding some branches, more branches as I go along. Trees are hard. So if you're painting this and you're thinking, how in the heck are you painting this tree? Trees are hard. But the main gist is you're painting that tiny trunk that's just jutting into it. You're painting branches starting from the trunk and then tapering off, a lot of them crisscrossing each other in kind of just like tapered lines, thin lines, and then blobs for the leaves all around. And then for the grass, you're starting from the tape and you're just kind of flicking upward in those kind of elegant, delicate horizontal strokes. I mean, vertical strokes from the bottom and then from the sides. And there you go. There is a fun kind of frame silhouette to put those two things together. And I really, really loved this end result. I think that the effect of having the tree being the really, really darkest thing, and then you seeing all the way back to that back mountain, I think you get the depth effect really well. So now it's time for my favorite part. This is Gray Lake, and we are going to do the loved and learned exercise. So some things that I loved. Man, do I love super granulating colors. It might be tricky to see in the video, but super granulating colors provide just this really excellent natural texture, and I got that throughout the whole scene, which kind of just accentuated the like foggy, ethereal, misty look that I wanted. I really, really loved, especially the subtle hues coming off of the lake, how I added, I started in that really, really light value, and then I slowly added a little bit of dark, a little bit more dark toward the bottom of the lake to accentuate those foreground ripples. I loved that. The contrasting values, I think the water was my favorite part, and I really liked experimenting with the clouds. Again, none of this is mandatory. If you want to paint this, you can pick and choose the things that seem doable to you. And the clouds are tricky, but I love those silver lining clouds. Things that I learned. If I didn't want the frame tree at the end, then I probably would have lowered the lake so the mountain took up most of the scene. Make sure to keep the darkest values in the front. One of those mountain layers is as dark as my trees, so it kind of messes with the depth that way. Branches and grass can kind of make the scene look more natural. Like the more branches and the more blades of grass that you have, that can make it look more natural. And I would also say use the wet on wet technique to disperse your pigment so it looks more blendy and misty. Yeah, and there you go. I hope you had fun with me, and I can't wait to see yours.